Marsha Brown. She's a writing fellow at the American Prospect. Marsha, my understanding is you've just returned from the border, and you've written a piece in the Prospect about Title 42. First off, just give us your take as to what you saw at the border.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. So I was down in Matamoros and Reynosa and in Brownsville a couple weeks ago. I was there for the last day of the Matamoros encampment, which was pretty well known. At one point, there were several thousand asylum seekers living there. When I was there were about 60 people left. And the people who were living there were in the Migrant Protection Protocol Remain in Mexico program, which is one of the policies that Biden has focused on dismantling and some of the policies that he's been rolling back. So he's been processing people with open MPP cases, which was the majority of people who were still in the camp. When I was there were about 60 people there who had more complicated cases, and they aren't actually part of the phase one processing, but because of the visibility, because of the leverage these asylum seekers had built in this camp, the Biden administration made an exception, and they were processed later on. So so that's kind of what I saw when I was first down there.
So in other words, part of what you're saying is that, and people should the backstory to this is that the Trump administration instituted at least two policies that essentially created almost like a refugee community. I don't know what else to say about it at the border, and that is the Remain in Mexico policy, which was you need to like process your stuff in Mexico regardless of where you're from, and the Title 42, which has very dubious legal authority, which essentially said the CDC, and I think from your piece I have gleaned that even people at the CDC didn't want to even issue this, but they were in many ways pressured, which basically said we're not going to let anybody in for fear of COVID, and which of course is pretty absurd because we have people crossing the border all the time right now. It's just you're not any more likely to have COVID if you have documentation or you're just an asylum seeker than you are if you're, a tourist or traveling to buy some whatever it is that you're buying on either side of the border. The Biden administration said we're going to make an exception on Title 42 for children.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the people who are there with children basically said, cross the border now unaccompanied. So give us a sense of like how that's all playing and what people are talking about. Why isn't Biden basically just getting rid of Title 42, period?
It's a great question, one that I have been asking a lot. Well, so absolutely, with respect to crossing the border, I crossed every day when I was down there, no problem. I didn't even have so much as a temperature check. Obviously asylum seekers who are being processed, who are in this Remain in Mexico program, they are getting COVID tests and they have a much lower positivity rate than the town of Brownsville, for example. There was some numbers that came out. But in terms of what's happening, for example, when I was there, the same day that the final few people who were in this camp left the camp, there was another group from Honduras that showed up, and they were hoping actually to be placed into MPP because they understood that to be a program that would get them into the United States. But of course, this was an awful program. There's a growing camp actually in Tijuana of mostly Black asylum seekers from Haiti, and they have put up this camp kind of like the Matamoros encampment, and it's raising a lot of visibility, and none of them are in MPP, and they have all been expelled under this Title 42 order, and the Biden administration has given no timeline for when they might have a chance to seek asylum, to be processed. I think what's really important to understand about Title 42 is that with the exception of unaccompanied children, like you said, and a few family units, particularly families with children under 7, there is no asylum at the border. There is currently no asylum. And that's definitely dubiously legal. It's pretty much illegal under international and legal law, as was American law. As was Remain in Mexico. Both of these policies have been, courts have said these are not legal policies. And I think right now, what a lot of people are saying about Title 42, and actually Jack Herrera did a great piece in Politico about this, is that there are some parents who arrive at the border with their children, and those children go across by themselves because they they can be admitted, and the family units feel like they can't be. So that's another important factor to think about with Title 42, is how it's affecting families making these awful choices.
Two things I'd like you to address. One is give us a sense of, well, first off, just will you please explain the law about asylum so that people understand this? Because there's this sort of just notion of like, that I think just a misinformation, a misunderstanding about what our law and what international law is about asylum. And then I'd like to hear just sort of, what are these camps like? I mean, how dangerous are the camps themselves? We know the dangers that are involved in the countries they're coming from, but let's talk about like the dangers of that are, associated with being in these refugee camps, for lack of a better term there.
Yeah. So I think what's important to understand about asylum, and again, asylum is very different from being a refugee. And that's actually what's so interesting about these camps. And when they were down there, is that you have to be in US territory to seek asylum. So you can't, be abroad and say, I'd like to seek asylum. That would be, if you did that, you would be a refugee. So you have to cross the border, that's the other thing about people saying, oh, people are crossing illegally. Well, a lot of those people are asylum seekers, so they're doing nothing wrong. That is not illegal. It is very much legal to cross the border and seek asylum in the US. And that is legal, that is both part of American law and part of international treaties that the US has signed and upheld for a long time. And I think what's also important to understand about that is there's this principle called non-refoulement, which is a French word, which just means that you can't send people back to where they would be in danger. And that's actually a big part of what, when people talk about Remain in Mexico, how that violated so many international principles of international law, is that you are sending asylum seekers, not just, maybe they're Mexican asylum seekers, but they could be Guatemalan, they could be Honduran, and they're being sent back to a place where they're in danger. And, when I was in Matamoros and I was in Reynosa, I spoke to people who had been kidnapped while they were in Mexico. One young man I spoke to, he was a year younger than me. He had experienced random gang violence in Guatemala, and he fled north to Mexico, and he thought he would have kind of a easy case for asylum, and he didn't, and he was stuck in this camp in Matamoros for almost 2 years. And while he was there, he was kidnapped, and his father, who lives in Maryland, was extorted for several $1,000s, I believe. And this is a very normal experience for a lot of the people who are waiting in these camps. Several organizations have documented hundreds of incidents of extortion, kidnapping, rape, death, and that's just recorded incidents. So they're very dangerous policies, both of them, and they're putting people in very serious danger.
And one of the other policies, I guess, that Biden announced via executive order at the start of his presidency was, I think, a lot less consequential than people realize about private prison contracts when it comes to detention of migrants. My understanding is that really just applies to the DOJ and not the ICE contracts. Can you talk about how that has kind of made things even, has not alleviated these conditions in the way that maybe it might on its face?
I'm actually unfamiliar with that, so I don't want to speak on that. But I can talk a little bit about how it is, ultimately with COVID and people trying to social distance, and the humanitarian crisis that Oro Bogado spoke so well about. Part of it is just you can't have as many people in the same facilities, and there are more children, and it is a humanitarian crisis, and people do need to be cared for humanely and decently.
Give us a sense of like what you saw could be. If you had the ability, what what would be the fix? Again, I just wonder, is this a question of we as a society just are not deploying the resources necessary, or is there an actual sort of like limitations to to absorbing this many folks, particularly when there's been this sort of backlog and a deterioration? And you tell me if there's been a deterioration in the systems here. I don't think that they've worked the way that they should have for at least a year and probably longer. And you had, just organizations can degrade.
Absolutely. So, I would definitely, when it comes to the systems, there's a lot of repair work that needs to be done, and the Biden administration has talked about this. I mean, they've used it really as an excuse, I think, but it is legitimate that there is a lot of repair that needs to be done. I mean, when it comes to Title 42, it actually seems to be contributing to the chaos that they're trying to not have. And I think what's important also to know about the sort of narrative of the crisis at the border is that 40% of people who are being apprehended, so those numbers that you're hearing, 100,000 people apprehended, 40% of those are people who have tried multiple times. So those numbers look really high. And it's also, there's seasonal migration, it's a new president, but many people started their journeys a long time ago. But in terms of, I mean, what is the solution? I mean, it's like end climate change. I mean, there are really deep root issues that people don't want to uproot their lives and have to come to a new country. You know, if they could, have a safe life for their family, they could put food on the table. And I think, I think the Biden administration has said that they are addressing that, but it's certainly not an easy fix. And then, on the other hand, the U.S. has room. The U.S. has room ultimately.
Well, that's what I meant. I mean, I'm saying, aside from, I mean, it's a separate issue in terms of the reasons why they're coming, but in terms of actually dealing with the absorption and the processes, I think Title 42, they thought was going to be, this is going to be we're going to let a little air out of the tires and that'll be easier. And we will have an orderly way of like having a flow of people that we can but it didn't, but they were wrong. I mean, they were wrong.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a backlog. It's partly Title 42. It's partly COVID. It's partly these policies like Remain in Mexico. I mean, there were 70,000 people in Remain in Mexico, and we don't know where a lot of them are because some of them are in Mexico, but not where they originally filed their cases. I mean, so it's just like, it is really complicated, and it is gonna take a lot to get it into an orderly system. But I mean, ultimately, especially with Border Patrol is kind of crying wolf. I mean, they have way more agents than they ever have had before, and they're saying that they can't manage normal seasonal migration. I mean, that's kind of just not true.
How much is what's going on with the Border Patrol? I mean, there was this like deal that was struck with the Border Patrol union in the last days of the Trump administration. How much is there, sabotage maybe is too strong of a word, but how much is there sort of like some misaligned, I guess, agendas between Border Patrol and the Biden administration?
Well, I mean, the Border Patrol union endorsed Trump. I mean, they've favored Trump. The union's weekly podcast has had him on the podcast. The podcast is also sponsored by Breitbart. So, I mean, these are all just kind of things to know about the union, about Border Patrol agents. I think Jen Budd, who is a former Border Patrol agent and writes about this and talks about this a lot, she does use the word sabotage, and she does use that word. So, I mean, some people do see what Border Patrol is doing as trying to create this crisis narrative, and trying to make the sort of seasonal rise in numbers into something that is bigger than it is.
Marsha Brown, I think you were very diplomatic about that. I imagine you've got to maintain some relationships to do your reporting work, and so the piece is very helpful. Folks should check it out. The American Prospect. Appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.